Everyone knows the story of Titanic, or at least, they think they do. Most of us were introduced to it through the legendary 1997 film, an epic of love, loss, and cinematic wonder. I was 7 years old when I first saw it. My father took me to a packed theater where there was only one seat left. The experience stayed with me. Not because of the romance or the costumes or even the music, it was the idea that something so massive, so unsinkable, could vanish into the cold Black Sea on its very first voyage, taking 1,523 souls with it. I remember collecting newspaper clippings, cutting out articles, pasting them into a scrapbook. Titanic became my obsession, but only later did I realize something most people miss. Titanic is not a love story. It is a catastrophic collision of engineering arrogance, human error, economic compromise, and natural force. The love story between Jack and Rose is fiction, but the real Titanic story? Far stranger, far darker, and far more human. It begins not on the day it sank, but the day it was conceived. Titanic was the crown jewel of the White Star Line, part of a trio of ships. The Olympic-class vessels, the Olympic, the Britannic, and the Titanic. Olympic came first, Britannic came later. Both had their own fates. Olympic served for decades. Britannic was turned into a hospital ship and sunk in the Aegean during World War I by a German mine. But Titanic? Titanic died a legend. She was built in Belfast, Ireland in 1912. At over 882 feet long, weighing 46,000 tons, and with a capacity for more than 3,500 people, she was the largest moving object humans had ever constructed. A marvel of industrial design, a floating palace, a technological triumph. She was also doomed from the beginning. Let's talk about the iceberg. It wasn't just any iceberg. It was born from snow that fell nearly 100,000 years ago, compressed into ancient glacial ice over time. At the moment Titanic began her voyage, that same iceberg had traveled over 3,200 kilometers from Greenland to the North Atlantic. It was one of 40,000 icebergs produced annually, but due to rare ocean currents, this one reached an area most icebergs never do. But the iceberg wasn't the only villain in this story. There were three design flaws, three silent decisions made long before the iceberg that sealed Titanic's fate. The first was aesthetic. During early design meetings, Titanic's investors, eager for luxury and visual grandeur, insisted on lavish grand staircases. To make space for these, designers shortened the vertical watertight bulkheads, the walls that could contain flooding if the ship was damaged. They only extended 10 feet above the waterline. In a collision, these walls would do almost nothing to stop the rising water. They were decorative. The second flaw was on deck. Titanic was capable of holding 64 lifeboats, enough for nearly all of its passengers. But lifeboats were bulky, unsightly, so the number was cut to 20, just 1,178 seats for over 2,200 passengers, less than 53%. The decision was driven by appearances, not safety. The third flaw came during construction. Steel was the material of the future, but Titanic was built in an era transitioning from wrought iron. Most rivets, the bolts holding metal plates together, were iron, softer, more brittle. In areas where heavy steel riveters couldn't reach, especially near the bow, builders used these weaker iron rivets. And when Titanic struck the iceberg, these rivets sheared off like paper clips. The hull opened like a zipper. But all of these flaws could have been addressed if the oversight agencies had demanded it. At the time, British maritime law didn't require enough lifeboats for every passenger. The law hadn't been updated in decades, based on much smaller vessels. The Titanic met all the regulations. Legally, she was ready to sail, but fate had more cards to play. Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, was a legend among elite travelers. Rich guests even booked trips specifically because he was at the helm. Ironically, this was to be his last voyage before retirement. Then came a strange twist. Just before sailing, Titanic's crew was shuffled. One officer was reassigned, another replaced him. In the rush, A key was misplaced. A key to a storage locker containing binoculars. This locker was in the crow's nest, the place where lookouts were supposed to watch for ice. They had no binoculars, because of a lost key. Add to this a rare cosmic setup. The night Titanic struck the iceberg, there was no moon. The sea was unusually calm, no waves crashing against icebergs, no reflection, no warning. The iceberg was invisible until it was too late. Now let's talk speed. Titanic was going 22.5 knots. That's over 41 kilometers per hour. Fast, but not reckless for its class. Still, with known iceberg warnings, 6 different ships had already sent messages. That speed was hubris, pure confidence, too much confidence. And that leads us to the deadliest mistake of all, communication failure. The ship's wireless operators were not paid to transmit safety alerts. Their primary job was to relay personal telegrams for wealthy passengers. That's where the tips were. That's where the money was. When the Californian, the ship closest to Titanic, sent a final iceberg warning, it was dismissed. The operator on Titanic replied, shut up, I'm busy." Minutes later, the Californian turned off its radio. That was Titanic's last chance, because when Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., it wasn't a head-on collision. That might have been survivable. Instead, an evasive maneuver caused the iceberg to scrape along the starboard side, ripping open 5 compartments. Titanic was designed to float with 4 flooded. 5 was too many. Water rushed in at 7 tons per second. By the time passengers knew anything was wrong, it was already too late. There weren't enough lifeboats. Evacuation was chaotic. Orders were misunderstood. Lifeboats left half full. Fathers were separated from families. Crew misunderstood the command. Women and children first, as women and children only. Within 2 hours and 40 minutes, Titanic was gone. Torn in half, swallowed by the sea. Over 1,500 people died that night. Many from the freezing waters, others trapped below deck. Many men drowned while their families watched helplessly from lifeboats. Some survivors were rescued by the Carpathia, the second closest ship, hours away. But the Californian, it never came. Its radio was off. Titanic didn't sink because of an iceberg. The iceberg was just the final nudge. Titanic sank because of pride, of greed, of outdated laws, poor communication, flawed engineering, human error, and bad luck wrapped in confidence. But from Titanic's bones came change. After Titanic, maritime laws were rewritten. Lifeboats became mandatory for all. Iceberg patrols were created. Radio silence between ships was outlawed. Engineering practices changed. A disaster gave birth to progress. Today, ships are bigger, safer, and more connected than ever. The symphony of the seas dwarfs Titanic, over 3 times its weight, longer, wider, smarter. And yet, no ship has captured the world's imagination like Titanic, because Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a mirror of human ambition, of what happens when we say, it can't fail. And it does.